Hi again. The point of this particular video is to introduce you to some of the practices that we're going to try and develop through the course of this semester in the writing skills that are specific to report writing. This will be a little different from writing an article. It'll have some similarities to writing a scientific article, but it'll also have some important differences that I think are worth developing our skills in. And then more generally, I would argue that every chance we have to practice our writing skills and get feedback on those skills and revise them as we go along, that's something to take advantage of because writing and communication generally are key capabilities that we as engineers have to have, whether we're in academic settings like this one, like me, or in an industrial setting where a lot of people assure me that their communication skills that they have and have developed through our program have really helped them to be effective in their jobs. So these are skills that I think we can hopefully all agree are worth pursuing. The format of the video is one that I hope I can keep a little bit shorter than all the details that you'll see in the associated slides. So please download those slides, maybe even have them open in a window on your computer while you're watching this video, and hopefully they'll be useful references for you to drill down and for you to use as a checklist as you're preparing your report of any sort. I'm a huge fan of checklists. I think checklists in our writing help us avoid some of the silly mistakes, some of the things we forget because we get so preoccupied with the deadline or whatever else is stressing us out. And a set of check boxes that we can go through before we submit something can help us avoid some of the silly mistakes that are just so easily avoidable if we just remember to check them. So let's jump into this. I realize I don't have a great t-shirt for writing. I got to do something about this. So I would argue writing is a common sense strategy to communication. So maybe we can agree on that or discuss it later. But I think a lot of writing, although writing is not a natural activity for humans as verbal communication is, writing is an artificial construct. But we can still develop these skills, and I think they all fit in the context of commonsensical approaches. So there are a couple of high-level goals that I want to achieve again with this writing to develop a core skill set through practice and feedback, and that's what we're going to do. Now, we can think about writing as really two different pieces, and I think this is sometimes helpful as we're attacking a writing project. The one piece of that is the structure. How do we organize the flow of our writing at all scales? How do we organize the words in a sentence, the sentences into paragraph into a section, and so on? That's an important piece to map out. This is where outlining can help us a lot, but clear structure is always going to be helpful in a writing assignment. The other piece is kind of the style, the writing style, the way we compose our sentences, the choices we make in the words, the use of voice, the use of for example, passive and active voice, all these sorts of details of the writing itself, maybe the softer aspects. Than the structure. But these are the two pieces we can talk about, and these are the two pieces to maybe have in your minds as you think about attacking a new writing project. The other thing I want to bring up here is, of course, in this modern era of artificial intelligence tools to help us with our writing, they can be helpful. This is an area that's in flux right now. I'm not dead set against it, but I can assure you that if you don't write on your own, you'll never learn to write on your own. So I think even the very strong advocates of artificial intelligence tools would say that they're a useful tool, like a calculator is a useful tool, but a calculator doesn't explain how math works. You can't use a calculator to figure out how to balance an equation. Just like I don't think yet you can use artificial intelligence tools to replace your cognitive process in organizing your thoughts and creating your own style. So we'll explore this maybe as the semester goes on and see where we land. So bottom line, try this on your own, try to develop your own writing skills, and then you'll have a strong basis for whatever other assistance that you can gain from these novel and pretty exciting tools that are emerging now. There's some structural aspects that, of course, I want to talk about first, and structure is very important. This is a place where, again, I'm going to point you at the slides, go through the structural elements you see in the slides. They list all of the elements that you have to have, for example, in the introduction section. So these reports are going to be divided into sections. Every report, I would argue pretty much everything technical that we write, has some form of introduction. Maybe very short, maybe a sentence or two, maybe much longer than that. But everything needs an introduction to frame the process, let's say, or the report context. And here we're in a lab, we're doing experiments, and so we have to create that context and frame that for us. Now, once we get the general structure, we have to dive into the structure of each of the elements. And again, I'll point you at the slides that go along with this video to read about each one of these topics, and definitely get back to me with questions. Same is true about results. The results here are probably the most important part, or close to the most important part, because they support the most important part, which is the discussion, which is what you individually take from the experiments, what you learn from these experiments. Now again, the discussion section is one of the most intellectually rich sections. This is where you display that you've been able to not just do the experiment, not just generate results, good quality results even, but how you use those results to answer some questions. And hopefully you can either have questions going into a lab or into anything else you write a report about, or you can discover topics, discussion points that you want to bring out as you see your results. So questions may emerge generically or somewhat organically from the results, but hopefully you have some even before you start any experiments. You know what it is you're looking to answer, and this is where you answer it. And you don't answer it vaguely, you don't answer it based on what you think might be true or what the textbook tells you should be true. You base it on your data. This is the beauty of labs. You collect the data, you have arguments that may come out of the literature, may come out of the textbook, that put the pieces together, but you have original data that has to fit into that story. And you will find cases where your data may not fit what the textbook or what the papers or what the conventions tell you should have been the observations you could make. And that's really pretty fun, because then you can start to dig into, why did you see a different result? Is that because you're an outlier? Maybe it's because you didn't measure things correctly. That's a possibility too, but you have to explore these possibilities. You cannot pretend that your data are meaningless in this experimental context. You have to go with the data you have and not the data you wish you had and maybe saw in a textbook or a paper later. So again, there's some specific points to the discussion here that I'll leave you to read that are specific even to this particular lab. The structure, the implementation structure, before you start writing it all, think about the overall structure. Think about what it is you want to achieve, lay it out. I encourage outlines. They're very helpful to plan your strategy. Outlining, like I say, it can be very, very helpful. It can be helpful to you as the writer. It can be helpful as a vehicle with which to talk to others. So you might come up with an outline for the material, and you could sit down with your lab partner and say, how does they want to, or how they pictured organizing that material. This is still where we can work together. This is also where you can even come to me or to one of the TAs, or and really ask, is this the right structure? Is this the right organization? And an outline is very lightweight. It's very easy to change. It's very easy to move things around, and it's very easy and quick to be able to give feedback on. So it's a really powerful tool. So those are kind of the high-level writing tools that I want you to think about when you're thinking especially about the structure of the lab report. Now, figures. Figures, big part of this lab. I would argue big part of any lab. They may contain photographs. That will be your main figure medium in this very first lab of the semester, but you'll have other data, graphs, whatever that you collect through the course of the semester. And those create figures, and figures are incredibly rich. Figures tap into another way of communicating than words and are very valuable. But again, they, like anything else, can be abused, misused, and even distracting and misleading if they're not done correctly. So I want to give you a couple of guidelines to think about as you're creating the figures for this particular lab. Now what you see here is an example that on the face of it, maybe it doesn't look too bad. There's a couple of lines there that need some explanation. There's a ruler in place, so you have some scale. That's always very important in a figure. But what is very odd about this figure is, unless this is the most abnormal heart that I've ever seen and we've ever had in the lab, This heart appears to be long and narrow when of course it is not. As you will have seen, the hearts are not long and skinny like this. And in fact, this is a simple artifact that comes about when somebody changes the aspect ratio of the figure they started with. So simple things like preserving the aspect ratio, very easy to make a mistake on, but also very easy to avoid. Including the ruler, again, very valuable. What you also see here is a figure caption. We'll talk more about those in just a sec. We need to incorporate all these elements into an effective figure to see it all make some sense. Now, when you're initially creating the figures, keeping perspective is important. I think I mentioned this before in the lab description. Trying to orient your figures so they fit some overall view of the larger scope. So if you picture the heart as sitting upright with the apex or the pointy part at the bottom and the base of the heart at the top, the way it sits in our chests, then that's a good perspective. Then you have a consistent way of viewing the heart. And if you put all the details where you zoom in on some feature, try and put those in that same perspective, then it becomes a lot easier to picture what it is that you're actually displaying or describing. So try and keep perspective so you know which way is which. Now, even when you have, I would argue, a somewhat skewed perspective, as you see in this example, adding some text, adding captions can help with that for sure. That provides a roadmap, some guidance. The figure caption can even say that the view is not upright heart position, but a view from some lateral rotated perspective that may, for whatever good reason, be optimal for the particular feature you're trying to show. But work with people's brains, their memories, their experience base to make the figure as accessible as it's possible to be. So, here you see a very simple example. This is the same figure, just rotated, obviously. But I would argue that the rightmost figure that you see here with the heart upright, as I just described, that's the context, that's the perspective that most of us find to be what we expect. And so when you see things in these other perspectives or these other orientations, that they're somewhat confusing and misleading. It's hard to tell which is left, which is right. And even though those are important words in the anatomy of the heart, for example. So try and keep a consistent perspective. Now, there are lots of great examples I want to show you as well, laying out the figures, the original images you capture, and then the figures you create. So here's an example of a single figure with 3 panels, and I would argue well crafted, assembled in a sensible way with somewhat consistent perspective. We're obviously exploring the vena cava in this particular case, and the gross structure of the heart. You can see that the large scale photo is quite clean. There's not too many labels in it. The students used a rod, which is available as part of the dissection kit, to highlight or literally lift up into view a certain part of the heart, which may be harder to see without that. So another feature here is while you see a bit of a hand in the figure, it's not overwhelming, and I'll show you other examples where it is a bit overwhelming. So this has a clean view, has clear labels, it has a very complete and useful caption that goes with it as well. So this is a nice example of figure to keep in mind as you're creating your own. Now, the photos you capture in the lab will have a mix of qualities. That will depend on the camera, on the lighting, on how careful you are, all kinds of different aspects, which you may not notice at the time, and you may have to correct later. So feel free to modify images. Here is an example of before and after the very simple enhance function that exists on any photo program, basically. Even on your phone, you can do some basic enhancing. And you can see just by enhancing, you brighten it up, you increase the contrast with a single click of a button. The net result is a clear image that's easier to see. Of course, one has to be careful about distorting the image, creating colors that weren't there in the original, or somehow altering the image in some way that isn't true to the original. But these kind of modest scale corrections are well within the realm of what's allowed and what's encouraged in this case. Every figure needs a figure caption, and the rules of figure captioning are really very simple. They're really very simple, so please observe them. They all have to begin with a title. They all have to be at the bottom of the figure. And then after the title, they include an explanation of the contents. Picture giving that figure to someone else who hasn't done the lab and expecting them to know what they're looking at. So this is not a deep dive into all the subtle features that might be there, visible or invisible even in the image. This is just a very concise description of here's the perspective, here's what's in the photograph or in the figure, and that's it. That's all you have to do. Like I say, it's not hard, but it's a requirement. And so we're going to try and be pretty strict on this. We're trying to really cultivate good habits in how figure captions are constructed. Here's an example of a pretty terrible one. Figure 2, top of heart. That is just not enough detail. That might be the title of the caption, but I would argue that no matter how good the figure is, how good the photographs are that make up that figure, this is not an adequate description. Whereas the one below, the lower one here says whole bovine organs, explains what we're seeing, explains there are 2 panels, A and B, describes briefly what's in those 2 panels. Figure captions don't have to be extensive, but there's no rule about how long they have to be or should be. That's going to be context dependent, and you'll have to use your own judgment. But there has to be enough explanation to be able to hand that figure to somebody else and have them understand at some level what is in that figure. So keep those simple ideas in mind. Here's, for example, a 2-part figure, 2 panels, A and B, 2 different views, one of the whole preparation, one of the heart, essentially dissected out of that preparation with a nice, complete figure caption, the figure caption that you actually saw just moments ago. So this is a nice example of a figure caption that's effective, that's clear enough, doesn't go on too long. Everybody should be able to write that. You'll see some little subtle things about this caption that I kind of like, which is that the figured number is there. All figures have to be numbered, and that the title is also bolded. That's optional, but it can help the reader quickly hone in on what the content is of that figure and help them decide whether to read it, how to use it. There are other little tricks that I'll mention here. This is a figure that's a little messy, a little hard to parse out. The ruler's not very visible, so the image is not great quality. So try and clean up, try and anticipate where this figure is going to appear as you're taking it, and remove extra blood. Put some paper towels or something behind the image so that it's clear and easy to see, and blood's not getting in the way. Blood is noise, if you will, in a photograph like this. So it's good to clean the figure, anticipate, like I say, what it's going to look like once it shows up in your lab report. What's also odd about this one is that the figure is slid all to the left, and the caption, as you look at the bottom, goes all the way across probably the entire page. And there's even a caption in the top, or a title in the top. I don't know what was going on here, and a caption at the bottom. One caption lives at the bottom, and it looks better generally when the photograph or the contents of the figure are centered underneath the caption. And in a situation like this, where you have a tall, narrow photograph, it's a natural thing to think about combining photographs to fill out that window that you have in your document so that each figure spans most of the width of the paper, and the single figure caption sits below it. That becomes ultimately easier to format, easier to handle in your document, and can be easily as effective. There's no reason why every photo has to have its own caption. They can be combined. It's very effective often to combine them. And here's an example of that combination. So here are 2 different figures put together, figure caption that spans the whole width of the page and the width of the individual images when they're put together like this. So it's a very clear, very nice example of a well-constructed figure. I'll note also, if you're looking at the bottom here, the figure B came from another person in the lab. So the group that was writing, or the person writing the report, and the group that person was part of didn't collect that particular image and realized after the fact that they'd sort of missed it, or maybe it didn't turn out, or maybe it didn't have high enough technical quality for their needs. And so they asked and acknowledged another group in the lab to provide and share that photo with them. This is okay as long as you give credit. It's true of many, many scientific content, scientific notes, ideas. It's perfectly okay to share across experiments, across groups, across the world, literally, as long as we acknowledge where those ideas, where those pictures in this case actually came from. Here's another example with a figure, lots of very clear visible labels. You notice the labels are all in contractions. If you look in the caption, you see the explanation for all those short acronyms, short forms of the labels. And again, this is a nice way to remove clutter in the images so that the actual wording in the images is minimized, but still be able to dive down into all the detail that a reader would want to have when they're observing this figure. Again, a figure that contains 3 different images in a row and has a nice detailed caption in this case. One other thing I want to bring up, it's always, I'm sure you know this because, your storage space, is important to you. You can't keep endless numbers of images or movies or even videos, and videos especially, and certainly not even music on your device, whether it's a computer or handheld device. There are limits to that. And so we're somewhat aware of how much space an image takes. Here's a great example where each one of the images you capture may be done at a beautiful high resolution. By the time you've cropped and shrunk and made them fit onto a page, most of that resolution is wasted. And the challenge I'm going to give you here is look at those 2 images and tell me which one of these is the full-blown version and which one of them is the compressed version, the one that's been reduced in size. It's reduced in size so much that one is 27 times larger than the other as the file that goes into the lab report. And you can see here that the image on the right has a tiny footprint compared to the image on the left. And yet I would argue that any differences that you might see between those 2 images are very subtle and likely never to be noticed on paper, and certainly not in an electronic version of a lab report like we're used to developing and delivering and grading. So think hard about how you can compress those images down, compress the whole file down so that the report stays small. There's no reason to waste disk space, waste upload time, all these sorts of things, when a little bit of engineering can reduce it dramatically. Here's an example from a previous year's lab group in which we had the original file. Here's an example of an original file, 17 megabyte, that was some simple compression that Adobe Acrobat, for example, will do for you in 1 step. This is an automatic process. It's literally just clicking a button and you'll get a smaller version. Here's an example that went from a 17 megabyte file down to a well below, so just over half a megabyte in size. Here's another example of I call it the winner of Abusive Pixels Award. So this is a file size at full resolution, 32 megabytes. There's no need for this. The reports you upload really shouldn't have to be more than about 5 megabytes in size. And that's not crazy to impose a limit like that. Many situations that I encounter in my daily life, and I think arise in industry too, have limits on the file size that we can report or we can submit as a report, for better or for worse reasons. The simple reason is that there's a definitely limit on the size of emails, for example, that many email systems will actually handle, and 5 megabytes is not unusual. So if you want to send a report to a colleague, to a superior, and they can't get that email because your file is too big, that's just such a wasted opportunity, and just shows a lack of technical sophistication that we can easily get around. So work with some of these tricks during this lab. Ask us for guidance, ask each other how you do it, and so let's see if we can keep the file sizes under control, obviously without sacrificing quality. I don't want a horrible pixelated image in a diagram in a lab report, but I think you'll find you can save a great deal of space and still maintain the quality. Now, while every figure needs a caption, every figure also needs a link to the text. So somewhere in the text for every figure has to be some text explaining what that figure shows us and arguably what it tells us. I mean, what's in that figure that's relevant to the flow of the conversation. Figures are not just stacked up to show we've done a lot of figures. Figures are part of the communication. So just like I would never show you a figure in a presentation without referring to it and describing it and explaining why it's useful, what it shows you and tells you, the same is true in a written document. These are just other elements of our vocabulary. These are visual elements in our flow of conversation, in our flow of description or discussion, and they have to be incorporated into that. Just like equations. When we're writing technical documents, they have equations in them. The equations have to fit within the flow of the text. So the figures have to appear in that flow as they appear naturally in the flow of the argument. And every figure has to be described somewhere in the text. Very simple. Simple rules to apply. So please get used to that. Now I want to switch to a couple of high-level comments about scientific writing, and then again, point you at the slides for lots more details. There are probably too many resources out there for writing. Scientific writing has become a huge topic. It's clearly recognized as incredibly important and for your success in your careers. And there are many, many resources for that. I'm going to point at one that happens to live on my website. It gets updated, things get added as I find new resources or find old ones that have disappeared or maybe not so up to date as they once were. So that's one place to start looking, but please just go searching and find a set of resources that you trust. Resources can be books, can be online guides, can be YouTube videos, doesn't matter. But you should develop over time a set of resources in writing that you can then go and look up, how do I use that word? Or how do I write the introduction of a lab report, right? A good set of resources should include that level of detail, and you'll find books on my webpage that certainly have that in them. And if you have questions, of course, let me know and I can steer you toward resources that I found most useful. There are a couple of simple things. This is what, the use of the English language is challenging. There's no question. English is one of the richest languages, has one of the biggest vocabularies, and which makes it wonderful in terms of communicating all kinds of subtle detail, but makes it really challenging and makes it easy to misuse words or hard to find the correct words. So a synonym resource is a good place to look. Again, there's so many sources online, it's very easy to find a synonym for a word, and it's easy to look up a word. Sometimes our word processing programs even have definitions built into them or a link we can use to get a definition of a word that we've just typed into our document. You'll see a number of other writing rules that I gave you there. Unfortunately, there are sort of pages and pages. No, there are a few pages of them. Have a look through them. Treat them as a checklist and use them as general guides. I mean, yes, read them through maybe the first time, internalize them a little bit, and then come back to them again and say to yourself, okay, in that section of the lab report, was I careful about using active voice when I could? Or did I slip into that kind of pretty boring mode, arguably, of endless passive sentences? I'm not a purist. You don't have to be absolutely certain that every sentence is active rather than passive, but think hard about your sentences and try and at least create a mix. It makes for a much more readable, clear, and usually shorter and more concise description of the same thing. And being concise is super important in our writing. Here's a little one, the Discher Dumbbell of Shame. This is something I'm pretty sure you haven't heard of. This comes from a particular guy named Kevin Discher, who was the high school writing teacher for a previous TA, okay? And so Brian was his name, and he learned this sort of simple view of a dumbbell, right? Two circles here. And what that's meant to highlight is when we use words too repetitively. So when you use the same word in close context, it makes for boring writing. And it also suggests a lack of kind of richness in vocabulary, because very often we're using the same word when we really can't think of a better word. And so get used to, in some phase of your proofreading, of looking at the important words and saying, is that the most accurate word I could use, or is there a better word I could find? And that's when a synonym guide is helpful. It's when you do a little digging and you'll usually find a better word. And there's an example here you can see with particularly egregious repetition of a particular word here. It's very easy to do. It slips into our writing pretty easily. This is what shows up in proofreading. Sorry, this is where this will reappear. So here you see the case of direction used 3 times within one sentence across 2 lines. So that's a triple Discher Dumbbell of Shame. So please check for those sort of things. It makes for really boring reading. So again, be concise, avoid superfluous information, avoid typos. As grad students, you have access to a program called Grammarly. If you haven't used it, for heaven's sakes, get it on your computers immediately. It can be integrated into Word documents, into any document sitting on a web page, if you're using Google Docs or whatever. It's a very useful program to screen for frequent typos that will creep into our writing. I use it now for every email I write, quite honestly, and I find it incredibly handy for just spotting those stupid little mistakes that we all make in our writing. Now we come to the physical act of preparing the document. Again, lots I could say here. I'm just going to put a brief plug in here for considering the tools of your writing craft. Now's a great time to revisit those, to think about what tools are best suited for your writing plans and your writing practice, and be willing to explore some new ones. Believe it or not, you have time to learn some new tools. More time, I would argue, than you're going to have later when you're in a job or under all kinds of other stresses. So Word is the one that everybody knows. It's the 800-pound gorilla in the writing game, but there are lots of alternatives. There are open source products that will act like Word, work like Word, have the same elements, in fact also have the PowerPoint equivalent and a spreadsheet equivalent. Those are available openly. Google Docs has a pretty powerful set of tools that you can explore. But we can spend some time talking about this if you want. The plug I'm going to make here is to also have a look at a tool you may never have experienced or explored before. It's called LaTeX. It's a very old tool, actually. It was created by a computer scientist who got frustrated with the limits of typesetting back in the 70s, literally. And believe it or not, that tool is still around, still being used extensively in the technical community, especially in the math, physics, computer science communities. It's a very powerful system that is most powerful and most useful as the documents get bigger. And if you're heading toward writing a dissertation, that may be the biggest document you'll ever write in your life. So having good tools to write even big documents can be really liberating so that you can focus on the content and stop worrying about where Microsoft or some other program is putting your figures. And this course is a fun place maybe to think about exploring LaTeX because you're working in short documents. So the investment's not huge. There's lots of help. I have a template for our lab write-ups that you can download from the Canvas site. So there's lots of help that we can give you in terms of using LaTeX. So just, try it on your own, do some reading on it. I have a whole web page dedicated to LaTeX, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Now a few observations and popular misconceptions that I have seen in the past, so I'm going to just kind of lay them out there to warn you. Latin is a wonderful language. It's the root of much of English. This is one of the reasons English is so rich, is we keep drawing words from other languages. There are no apparent barriers to which language we'll pull content from. And Latin is certainly the root of a great deal of English. So we have one vena cava and two venae cavae. So this is the singular plural problem that comes up again and again. There's one atrium and two atria. So try and use these words properly and carefully. Another fun fact, if you go searching on the internet for vena cava, you'll find that there's actually a fashion line under the name of vena cava. So, try and use words correctly and make the context clear of what they mean. The cow has two vena cava. It's another sort of feature of this particular lab, just like human hearts do. But in human hearts, those vena cava bring the blood back from above and below the heart, whereas in the cow, they bring it in from the front of the heart and the back of the heart. And so just make sure you see the diagram here. There's a cranial vena cava and a caudal vena cava. And cranial, think of cranium as in brain, as in head. The cranial end is the head, the end closest to the head, and the caudal is the end closest to the tail of the cow. So just use words carefully in this lab especially. These are things that I've noticed again and again show up in this lab. Another misconception, a functional misconception, is sort of what the role are of the chambers in pumping blood. This is a great lab to explore some of these questions. I'll again point you with these slides, have a look at these, see if they're helpful in thinking about, for example, what does the atria actually do? Does it provide some massive pumping function? Turns out not, actually. And so making sure that you don't overstate the role of the different chambers, which is essentially the same as saying ascribing function to them based on the structures that you observe that may or may not be correct. And this is the high-level goal here, is to make sure that when we ascribe function, we have a reason for that rather than just making things up based on the structure we see. The structure can be misleading, and there can be multiple functions even with the same structures. So being careful about that is important. A great example of structure-function relationship is in the structure of the valves. That's a question that students often will tackle in this particular lab. So observe the valves carefully and try and hypothesize about what the connection might be between the structure of those valves and their actual function. Here's some graphs that I'll include here about how the left and right ventricles compare in terms of their volume and some of the parameters that describe them. There's another chart that I can provide, or that's in the slide set that you can have a look at, that describes the key parameters of the heart, ventricle, weight, shape, heart rate, all these sorts of things across species. This is kind of interesting to know, especially since we're dealing with the cow, to be able to put the cow heart structural features and parameters in the context of the human heart, for example, and then also included some other animal species that we either interact with or live with or certainly use in science on a regular basis. So it's useful to develop a certain comfort with these sort of numbers and know sort of where we sit and take those into consideration as we're interpreting the data. Similarly, there are some important differences between veins and arteries you'll be able to explore in this lab, and I encourage you to certainly do that in the labs. Final thing I want to talk about is what one student in the past called unusual structure. So you may find, not always there, but you may find there is a structure that sits between the septum and the free wall of one of the ventricles. And so don't be shocked, don't be surprised. It exists. It's also known in humans. The oldest reference I found to this is a paper from 1896 in which this structure was first described, at least. I don't know when it was first observed. And it was called the Moderator Band. And you can do a little digging, Google search to figure out what a moderator band is supposed to do, but think about it yourself. Have a look at that structure. Try and imagine what function it might have in the normal cardiac cycle. That's a useful exercise, intellectual exercise. And then, of course, look it up and you'll get the right answer somewhere on the internet. But it's a great example of how we can look at an unusual structure we may not have expected to see, because it's not, for example, in the little plastic heart model that we have or the big plastic heart model we have in the classroom, but it still has an important function, and it definitely occurs in a number of animal species. And finally, just as a side note, if you Google moderator band, you'll find there's actually a band called the Moderator Band, and they're a group of medical students who got together many years ago in the early 60s, formed a band, performed in various settings, I guess in medical school, and I guess still get together every once in a while. Here's a 2012 photograph of the Moderator Band as they look today. So keep a sense of humor about all this. Make sure that you have fun in this lab. This lab, often is one of the most popular ones. And also, again, use it as a way to develop these writing skills that we'll be honing and refining throughout this semester. Hope you have some fun. Hope this was useful, and I look forward to seeing what you submit to us and reading your writing and helping you improve it. So take care. See you soon. Thanks for your attention.